Quick question for you. What do universally loved bands like Pantera, Blink-182, Linkin Park, Slipknot, Suffocation, Yellow Card, and NOFX have in common? The answer is that they were all absolutely hated in their prime by the exact same kind of people that love them today. What's up, everybody? I'm Finn McKenty. This is the Punk Rock MBA, and today I'm here to talk about something interesting that I've observed many times over the years that I call the 10-year rule. If you would have told me in 1994 that NOFX would be regarded as like a real punk band 10 years later, I would have never believed you. Or if you told me in 2006 that Job for Cowboy and Bring Me the Horizon would be loved by elitists on Reddit, I would have told you were out of your mind. But here we are in 2019, and both of those things are true. So what's going on here? Like, how does a band go from hated to loved in just 10 years? Well, in this video, I'm going to explain it. I'm going to break it all down for you in detail. But before I do that, I wanted to plug two things. Number one, I do have merch. So if you're interested in that, there's a link in the description. Number two, I have a Patreon. Patrons get access to a bunch of stuff like an audio-only podcast feed of the videos, a Discord server. I do reviews of patrons' bands or podcasts, YouTube channels, whatever. So if that sounds interesting, there's also a link to that in the description. And with that out of the way, let's get into it.
Congratulations on 10 years!
Part one, the 10-year rule. So like I said, I call this the 10-year rule because that's generally about how long it takes for a band to go from hated to loved. Sometimes it's a little bit less than that, sometimes a little bit more, but the stages of this cycle are actually very predictable. So I made this little chart that breaks it all down for you. In a nutshell, what I'm saying is basically that the band's credibility in the eyes of the gatekeepers and tastemakers and all those people I make fun of all the time is inversely proportional to the band's relevance. So let's break that down, starting with stage A, what I'm calling kids in a garage. So you can see at this point, their relevance is at its lowest and their approval is at its highest. And that's very simple because at this point, nobody knows who the fuck they are. They're just kids playing in a garage or to 6 people in a dive bar. Nobody gives a shit. They're completely irrelevant in like the cultural or commercial sense, but they have the gatekeepers and tastemakers sort of tacit de facto approval because of the fact that they are an independent band and those people are all about like support independent music. At least until the band actually gets some traction and enters stage B of their career, what I'm calling the what the fuck is this shit stage. This is where they first get on the radar of the gatekeepers, of the bloggers and reviewers and journalists and all those kind of people. And of course, anytime those people come across something new, especially if it's different and unique and interesting in some way, their first impulse is of course to shit on it. So this stage is when you start to see things like blogs writing snarky hit pieces called like, "We just found the worst band in the world." But as I've said a million times in other videos, the fact that the gatekeepers and tastemakers hate these bands really doesn't matter. Because the truth is that those people's opinions are just that. And they can't stop an artist that actually has the support of the fans. So it is inevitable that the band is going to move on to the next stage of their career, stage C, what I'm calling the trendy bullshit for posers phase. And I say that not because that's what I think, but because that kind of represents the general state of the opinion among the gatekeepers and tastemakers when a band reaches this stage. This is where the band reaches their commercial and cultural peak, and of course, that means it's also when the elitist hate is at its peak. Or to put it another way, as I did on this graph, when their credibility is at its lowest. A telltale sign that a band is in this phase of their career is when you start seeing basement neckbeards make these like poorly lit one-take webcam rant videos called like "Band Name Here Rant" or "5 Reasons Why Band Name Here is Absolutely Terrible." This phase can last a while. This could be like 2 or 5 years, but it's inevitable that eventually they're going to move on. Any band can only stay in the crosshairs of the gatekeepers for so long, and so eventually they will move on to the next phase of their career, stage D, or what I'm calling the turning point. And as you can see from the chart, this is where the two lines cross, which means this is where the band has the potential to start going from hated to loved. Because at this point in their career, the band is probably past their prime creatively, and the gatekeepers are honestly just kind of getting tired of taking shots at them. I mean, how many like breathless one-take rant videos and snarky blog posts can you make about one band before you just get sick of it, right? Eventually, it's time for someone else to take their place. The gatekeepers move on to focusing on some other band that is now just entering phase B of their career, and for the first time, the haters are leaving this band alone.
This one goes out to all my haters out there. I see you. I've been reading your comments and I got something to say.
which is cool, except the flip side of that is that it also means they're just in general not in the headlines as much as they used to be. This is when, as an artist, you're just kind of in limbo. No longer popular enough that you feel like a cool guy big shot, but yet not respected enough that you feel like you can kind of bank on your credibility. You wonder, like, am I washed up? Am I irrelevant? Like, is my moment gone? It's a tough place to be in. A lot of bands never make it out of the slope of despair. They just decide to move on, do other things with their life, start a family, whatever. But the bands that do keep going eventually emerge in a pretty cool place. They emerge in phase E of their career as legends. This is where they finally rise from the ashes as a new band that's almost like the mirror image of the band that they used to be. In the first half of their career, you were considered by the gatekeepers to have terrible taste if you liked the band. Now, in this phase of their career, you have terrible taste if you don't like them. It's amazing. And like I said, usually this takes about 10 years, and that's why I call it the 10-year rule. So that's the model in broad strokes. Let's go through a couple examples so you can see how it works in concrete terms. I'll start with NOFX because they're probably the first band where I observed this happening. They started in like 1983 or 84, I think, so that would be phase A of their career, the Kids in the Garage. A few years later, maybe around 1989, 90, 91, with White Trash, Two Heaves and a Bean, or Ribbed, that is where they entered phase B, started getting a little bit more attention, and that's when I noticed that people started talking a lot of shit about them in the pages of Maximum Rock and Roll and the other zines that were the voice of real punks back then. But it really hit a fever pitch with phase C of their career, which I would say was maybe 1994 to 1997 or so. Basically like the punk In Drublic through So Long and Thanks for All the Shoes kind of years. I know it may be hard for some of the younger people watching this to believe, but trust me, they were absolutely fucking hated back then by real punks. Like, I think maybe only Green Day was more hated than NOFX. Because NOFX were really kind of the poster boys for the whole like 90s skate punk thing. And that meant that they were the epitome of trendy bullshit for posers who shop at the mall. And among real punks, it was definitely not acceptable to like NOFX. The hack was that it was okay to like Propaganda because they sounded like NOFX, but they had cool political lyrics. But anyhow, that lasted for a few years, and then they entered phase D of their career, maybe around like 2000 or so, with Pump Up the Volume. Nobody was really hating on NOFX anymore. On the other hand, nobody was like really stoked on NOFX either. They were just kind of existing. They were in the slope of despair. And then I noticed that maybe around like 2003 or so with War On Errorism, that is when the lines crossed. That is when they made the switch to legends. And it was not only okay to like NOFX, it was like mandatory. At that point, you were now considered a poser if you didn't like NOFX. It was the exact opposite of how everybody felt about them at the beginning of their career. This is the 10-year rule in action. Or as a more recent example, let's look at the Devil Wears Prada. For them, phase A would be like 2005 to 2007 or so, when they were pretty much unknown outside of the like Midwest Christian metalcore scene. They entered phase B of their career, and phase C, I would say, was roughly 2009 to 2011 or so. Let's say like from Roots Above to Dead Throne. That's when they hit number 10 on Billboard. They were on the cover of Alternative Press. They were doing Mayhem with like Slayer and Slipknot. Like, they were killing it, and this is also when the hate for them was at its peak, or to put it another way, when their credibility was at its lowest. If you look at metal blogs from around that time, you'll find plenty of articles about how emo and metalcore are terrible, the worst thing in the world, and the Devil Wears Prada's name is frequently brought up in those. As usual, the kids loved them, the gatekeepers hated them. But as always, that didn't last forever. Phase D of their career started in maybe like 2012. That's when they found themselves in that awkward slope of despair for a couple years. But they stuck it out, and yeah, maybe they're not putting up the kind of numbers they did at their peak, but here they are. Now they've finally made it to phase E. Now they're considered pioneers of metalcore, and I would say they're pretty much universally respected among people in their 20s. Again, if you told me 10 years ago this was gonna happen, I would have never believed you. It would be impossible for me to imagine a world in which the Devil Wears Prada was considered credible, because back then the only people that liked them were high school kids. But now those high school kids are all grown up. They are the ones who define what good taste is, and the Devil Wears Prada earned their seat at the table. And once again, it took almost exactly 10 years for that transition to happen. 2007 to 2017, let's say. And lastly, one more example to really drive this home, Slipknot. And again, this might be hard for younger people to believe, but I can't think of a band that the metal establishment hated more than Slipknot in the early 2000s. Like, I remember trying to start a band in maybe like 2001 or so, and I went to like go jam with this one drummer, and he sort of sheepishly confessed to me that he kind of liked Slipknot, as though he was expecting me to like flip the table and be like, "What the fuck, man?" and storm out of the room, because that is how much the metal tastemakers thought of them as trendy bullshit for posers who shop at the mall at that time. That was their phase C, and as far as their phase D, well, they never really had like a decline in commercial success, but there was that period from maybe like 2010 to 2015 where you definitely didn't hear their name as much as you used to. But then something happened. The axes flipped, and around like 2016 or so, I would say, like everybody started talking about Slipknot as like their Slayer or their Pantera, the band that got everybody from that whole generation into metal. That's how I knew that they had made it to phase E, which is where they are now. They are certified legends, easily, I would say, the most important band in metal of the last 20 years. And I could go on about this forever, because the fact is that a huge chunk, like actually almost every band that is considered like legendary now and is universally loved, almost every single one of them was hated when they came out. Green Day, New Found Glory, Suffocation, Under Oath, Linkin Park, Blink-182, Yellowcard, Pantera. Those are just a couple examples off the top of my head, but the list of bands that went from hated to loved like this is almost endless. And you might be thinking, well, yeah, of course people ended up loving those bands because they're great. But what about this band or this band or this band? People are never gonna start loving that band because they're terrible. Well, you are wrong. This pattern plays out for literally every single band you can think of.
Fuck that fucking Limp Bizkit band, man. If I see them, I'm gonna beat every one of them to sleep, man.
For example, I can't think of a band that people hated more than Limp Bizkit, but look, in 2019, I would say that they have just started to enter their legends phase. The tone of the conversation about Limp Bizkit is definitely more positive than negative these days. Now, it took more like 20 years for them to get here instead of 10 years because people really fucking hated them, but still, it's happening. I mean, I have tons of comments like this one. Fred Durst never tried to rap, by the way. He was always dope on the mic. I never thought we'd see the day when somebody would say that Fred Durst was always dope on the mic, but here we are. What a time to be alive.
This time right now is real. You gotta take a shit.
And as I've talked about in my most hated band series, you're starting to see the same thing happen with a lot of the other, like, almost universally despised bands like Attila, Emmure, and Brokencyde. All those bands definitely still have a lot of haters, and I would say that overall the tone of conversation about them is probably still mostly negative, but the tone of the conversation is starting to change. They are starting to get a little bit of respect, and even a little bit of respect is something I could have never seen happening back in like 2010. And you know what that means, right? Yep, you guessed it. It's only a matter of time until Five Finger Death Punch and Nickelback make their transition into Phase E and are considered visionary pioneers that everybody loved all along.
I thought it would never happen.
So before I close it out, let's talk about how this happens. How does a band go from here, where they're basically universally hated, to here, where they're universally loved? I think there's basically three ways that this happens. The first scenario, the most unfortunate one, is that some sort of tragedy strikes. Lil Peep and Suicide Silence are the first examples that come to mind. In both cases, somebody died in tragic circumstances, and that kind of instantly changed the tone of the conversation. Fortunately, that scenario is pretty rare. The second one is when a band makes a conscious effort to appeal to the gatekeepers. They give in to the pressure and they make a clear, conscious effort to appease the haters. The two examples of this that come to mind are Job for a Cowboy and The Devil Wears Prada, both of which were written off as like gay scene bands by the metal establishment at the time. And from reading interviews with them back then, you can tell that that really bothered them. Like, they wanted to be taken seriously. And although it kind of works, like I would say both of those bands are mostly respected now, I'm not sure that it's worth it. I think in both cases, earning the approval of the gatekeepers probably held those bands back. Like, it's almost like selling out in reverse. Like, instead of changing your music to appeal to a bigger, more mainstream audience so you can make some money, instead you change your music and image to appeal to a much smaller underground audience that will never give you a dime. Like, yeah, you earn the approval of the gatekeepers, so what? What's that worth? Like, can you pay your rent in blog credibility?
I blog about blogging.
But anyway, that's a pretty uncommon scenario. What you see most often is scenario 3, where the band just simply outlasts the haters. The previous group of gatekeepers who hated them ages out of the scene. The kids who were their fans and defenders age up a little bit and then become the next generation of gatekeepers, and boom. All the bands that were hated 10 years ago are now loved. That's how it works. If you are an MMA fan, you'll recognize this as something kind of like the Nick Diaz, Nate Diaz kind of game plan. Be a punching bag, like let your opponent kick the living shit out of you for 10 minutes till they just get exhausted and they mentally break, and their opponent is just like, what the fuck? This guy never stops coming no matter how much I punch him. Okay, fine, you win. So if you are in a band that's currently in that slope of despair, hang in there. Just give it a few more years, wait for your fans to age up a little bit, wait for all the journalists and bloggers and reviewers and stuff that hated you in the beginning to age up and move on and die of old age or whatever, because then you will finally get the respect that you deserved.
If you don't get no respect, you might be a redneck.
All right, guys, there you have it. That is the 10-year rule. That is the formula for how a band goes from hated to loved. Let me know in the comments if you have seen this happen, and if you have, let me know what bands it happened to. I think it's super interesting. Like, literally any band will become loved if they just fucking stick around long enough. It's amazing. Before I let you go, I wanted to thank everyone who supports me on Patreon at the true cult level or above. Thanks to you guys, I'm now able to start a podcast that's gonna launch in January. With the money I get on Patreon, I'm hiring an editor and producer to do all that for me. So that's enabling me to do a podcast. Thank you guys very much for that. I'm really excited to get this off the ground. If you are interested in supporting me on Patreon, there's a link to that in the description. You get like an audio only podcast feed of all the videos. There's a private Discord. I do reviews of members' YouTube channels or bands or podcasts or whatever other projects you might have. So if that sounds interesting to you, check it out and link in the description. I'm gonna sign off for now, but I will see you next time.